He didn't see them gathering at first. Most mornings, he kept his head low, eyes on the cracked concrete beneath his boots, doing everything he could to avoid drawing attention. But on that cold morning at Lanchester Field, attention found him anyway. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic tang of old aircraft and the faint vibration of engines warming far in the distance. The base was already alive with routine, boots marching, radios buzzing, hangar doors scraping open with the groan of aging steel. But the noise that rose above all of it was laughter. It came from his left at first, then behind him, then from the front, a wave spreading outward through the yard as more soldiers turned to watch. Some nudged each other. Some folded their arms, smirking, waiting for the show to start. Others simply stared, quietly grateful the target wasn't them today. At the center of their circle stood the man who had never fought back, never raised his voice, never defended himself even when the mockery cut deepest. Staffman Henry Cole. Thin, tired, with the kind of posture shaped not by age but by years of being pushed down. His uniform was always a little older than everyone else's, a little more faded, a little less impressive. Even now, the winter light made the frayed threads on his sleeves stand out like scars. He hadn't done anything that morning to provoke them. He rarely did. Sometimes they laughed at the way he walked, other times at the way he stood, or the way he carried his tools. Any excuse was enough, and today, the excuse was a simple stumble. He had tripped on the uneven pavement while carrying a crate of spare parts. The crate hit the ground, scattering bolts and metal pieces across the yard. The metallic clatter echoed through the base like an announcement. And just like that, the humiliation began. A young airman pointed first, snickering loud enough for the others to hear. Someone else joined in. Soon, 5 men were circling closer, laughing openly at the sight of Cole scrambling on his knees to gather the scattered pieces. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from something sadder, the exhaustion of a man long accustomed to moments like this. The base commander, Captain Reeves, watched from a distance near the hangar. Reeves didn't laugh, but he didn't intervene either. He simply folded his arms and observed, as if the scene were an expected part of morning operations. The message was clear: this wasn't bullying. This was order. This was hierarchy. This was what happened to men like Henry who had never earned respect, or so they thought. As Cole reached for another bolt, a boot kicked it away from his fingers. He lifted his eyes and saw Sergeant Dalton towering over him, broad-shouldered and full of pride he hadn't yet earned. Dalton was the kind of man who treated mockery as leadership, who believed that breaking someone made you stronger. He grinned as he nudged the bolt again with the tip of his boot, sending it skittering across the ground. Cole swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay quiet, to keep collecting the pieces. Silence had always been his only defense. A second boot appeared beside Dalton's. Then a third. The circle tightened. Someone said that maybe Cole should wear training wheels. Someone else said they'd seen better balance on a newborn calf. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the hangar walls, drawing more eyes toward the scene. Even soldiers who didn't usually participate stood watching, caught between discomfort and curiosity. Cole didn't look at any of them. He didn't plead. He didn't defend himself. He simply kept gathering the scattered pieces, placing them back into the crate one by one. His movements were slow but deliberate, almost graceful, as if he had learned to move through humiliation the way others learned to move through rain. But the men around him wanted more. Dalton stepped forward and kicked the crate itself, knocking it out of Cole's hands. The small parts spilled again, bouncing in every direction. The sound was sharp, louder than before, and for a moment, the entire yard went quiet. Cole froze. Not because of fear, but because something in the way the crate fell seemed to echo far beyond that morning. Something about the sound triggered a memory deep inside him, a memory he had spent years burying beneath silence and service. His eyes closed for just a second, a moment too brief for the others to notice, but long enough for something old, something painful, to stir inside him. Then the laughter resumed. Dalton leaned down, his voice dripping with cruelty as he told Cole that the base didn't need weak men, that maybe it was time he retired, that men like him weren't meant for anything more than sweeping floors and fixing scraps. The words hit harder than the kick. Cole didn't respond. He simply lowered his head and resumed picking up the scattered pieces for the second time. His hands moved slower now, as if weighed down by invisible chains. Around him, soldiers whispered about how pathetic he looked. How useless. How embarrassing. But one man wasn't laughing. At the edge of the group stood Airman Caleb Foster, one of the youngest recruits on the base. He watched Cole with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Something about the older man felt different, not weak, not useless, but heavy, like someone carrying a story too large for anyone else to see. Foster didn't know why he felt that way, but he couldn't look away. As Cole reached for the last bolt, Dalton stomped down on his hand. Cole flinched for the first time. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Even Reeves raised an eyebrow. Physical intimidation was one thing, but this was different. This was a line crossed, yet no one stepped forward to defend him. Dalton leaned in, lowering his voice so only Cole could hear, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable. He told him that he didn't belong here, that the base didn't need dead weight dragging everyone else down. Cole's breath trembled, but he held it quietly. Then, slowly, Dalton lifted his boot and stepped back, satisfied. Cole retrieved the final bolt with shaking fingers and set it gently inside the crate. Then, with every pair of eyes watching him, he rose to his feet. The morning sun had climbed a little higher now, casting long shadows across the yard. One of those shadows stretched behind Cole, tall, straight, almost regal, in sharp contrast to the way the men around him saw him. He didn't look at Dalton. He didn't look at Reeves. He didn't look at anyone. He simply turned and walked away. But as he walked, Foster noticed something the others didn't, a small patch on Cole's sleeve, old and faded, partially torn at the edges. A patch that didn't match the rest of his uniform. A patch Foster had only seen in history books and forgotten military archives. The airman's eyes widened. Because that patch didn't belong on a nobody. It belonged to a legend. And suddenly, the humiliation that had united the base that morning was about to become the mystery that divided it. Henry Cole lived exactly as he walked through the base, quietly, without taking more space than he thought he deserved. When the day's duties ended and the noise of aircraft faded into the distance, most men from Lancaster Field disappeared into town, into bars, restaurants, noisy gatherings, or warm homes filled with family and laughter. Cole walked in the opposite direction. The road leading away from the base ran straight for a while, then curved toward a stretch of land that seemed forgotten by time. There, behind a line of bare trees and rusted fences, stood a small, weather-beaten house that sagged slightly at one side, like a tired man leaning on a cane. The wooden steps creaked under his boots as he climbed them, the sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He unlocked the door and stepped inside to the soft smell of old wood, dust, and coffee that had been brewed hours before and left to cool on the counter. The house was small enough that a single glance could take in nearly everything: the narrow kitchen, a worn-out couch, a small table with one chair, and a short hallway leading to a tiny bedroom. There were no pictures on the walls. No decorations. No signs that anyone but him had crossed that threshold in a very long time. Cole placed the crate of tools he'd brought from the base near the door and shrugged off his jacket, hanging it on a hook that had been bent out of shape from years of use. His shoulders relaxed slightly when he was alone. The silence wrapped around him like an old coat, one he didn't particularly like but had grown used to wearing. He walked to the sink and rinsed his hands, watching the thin stream of water wash away the dust and grease of the day. He stared at his fingers for a moment, at the faint scars, at the knuckles worn by time and work. There were lines there that didn't come from clumsiness or weakness, but from something far older and harsher than the man at the base would ever imagine. The coffee on the counter was cold, but he poured it into a chipped mug anyway. Warmth was a luxury he had learned to live without. He took a sip, then sat at the small table by the window. The view outside offered nothing special, just a patch of dry grass, a few scattered trees, and, in the distance, the faint silhouette of the base water tower against the pale sky. Yet he watched it every evening as if it were a different painting each time. From here, no one laughed at him. No one kicked over his work. No one looked at him like a burden. Here, he was simply Henry. On the table lay a folded newspaper from weeks ago. He hadn't bought it. It had been left behind at the base and someone had thrown it toward the trash. He had picked it up quietly and taken it home, more out of habit than interest. The headlines no longer stirred anything inside him. Wars, crises, speeches, awards, faces of men in uniforms shaking hands in front of cameras. He knew what those ceremonies felt like. He knew what it meant to stand straight, chest lifted, as medals were pinned to a uniform that still smelled of smoke and adrenaline. He remembered flashbulbs, microphones, firm handshakes. He remembered the sound of applause echoing around him like a storm he hadn't asked for. He remembered, too, how quickly applause fades. Cole reached for the newspaper, then paused. His hand drifted instead toward a small drawer beneath the table. The wood stuck slightly as he pulled it open, the rails dragging with a tired protest. Inside, there were few things: an old pen, a folded handkerchief, a worn Bible with its cover almost detached, and, buried beneath them, a small velvet box. He stared at the box for a long moment, his fingers hovering over it without touching. It was the kind of object that made breathing feel heavier. The kind of thing that could turn a quiet evening into a battlefield of memories with a single glance. Eventually, he let his hand drop away and closed the drawer again with a soft click. Not tonight. He stood and moved instead toward a shelf in the corner of the room. At Primero Olher it held only a few tools, some screws, and a couple of manuals from the base. But behind one of the manuals, pressed against the wall, there was a photograph, old, edges curled, colors faded. A younger man in flight gear stood beside a jet, squinting into the sun, expression serious but bright with a fire that hadn't yet been dimmed. His shoulders were square, his posture confident. There was strength in the way he held himself, the kind of quiet command that didn't need to be announced. Anyone else might not recognize him. But Henry did. He returned the manual to its place, hiding the photograph again. The men at the base saw only what was left of him, the worn-out staff man who carried crates and fixed what others broke. They didn't know that there had been a time when he didn't just walk the runway, but owned it. When the sound of engines roaring to life had meant something else. When his name had been spoken with respect rather than irritation. He had given all of that away himself, a long time ago. He moved to the stove and reheated a pot of soup he had prepared 2 days earlier. The food was simple: potatoes, carrots, bits of whatever he could afford that week. He ate slowly, listening to the ticking of a clock on the wall. Every sound in the house was familiar, predictable. There were no surprises here. No laughter. No jeers. Just time moving forward in small, steady steps. When he finished, he washed the bowl and placed it carefully in the drying rack. Then he dried his hands and walked down the short hallway to his bedroom. The room was even simpler than the rest of the house: a narrow bed, a small nightstand, and a wardrobe that creaked when opened. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots, placing them neatly beside each other. The motions were automatic, almost ceremonial. Before lying down, He reached once more for the nightstand drawer. Inside, folded with almost obsessive care, was an old letter. The paper had yellowed with age, and the ink had faded in places, but the words were etched into his memory. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. Yet tonight, perhaps because of what had happened that morning, because of the boot on his hand, because of the laughter that still echoed in his ears, he unfolded it anyway. His eyes traced the familiar lines. Commendations. Praise. Acknowledgement of bravery under impossible conditions. Above and beyond. Saving countless lives. Extraordinary courage. Words he had once believed meant something that would last. Words that had once defined him. Now, they existed only in this letter, in this small, quiet bedroom that no one ever entered. He lowered the paper and closed his eyes. Outside, wind moved through the trees, whispering against the cracked window panes. From far away, faintly, he could hear a jet passing overhead, a distant echo of the life he used to live. A life no one at Lanchester Field knew belonged to him. To them, he was just the man who dropped crates. The one who got in the way. The one they laughed at in the mornings. He refolded the letter carefully, reverently, as if it were something sacred. Then he slipped it back into the drawer and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but his mind stayed awake a while longer, returning to the moment Dalton's boot crushed his hand into the concrete. Not because of the pain, but because, for the first time in a long while, something inside him had flinched that he couldn't push back down. Something that felt uncomfortably close to anger. The next morning arrived with a brutal cold that clung to the concrete like frost on glass. The sky above Lanchester Field was pale and colorless, the kind of morning that made everything feel heavier than it was. Most men rushed through their routines, eager to get indoors or find excuses to stay near heaters. But Henry Cole, as always, stepped into the chill without hesitation, the weight of the cold no greater than the weight he carried every day. He walked across the yard with a toolbox in hand, heading toward Hangar 2. The old metal building loomed ahead, ribs of rust streaking down its sides like the remnants of battles long past. Cole had been assigned to inspect the ventilation system and patch whatever the night shift had neglected. It wasn't glamorous work, but around here, nothing he did ever was. The moment he reached the hangar door, he heard them. Laughter. Footsteps approaching. Voices dripping with the same energy as the morning before. As if humiliating him once had only sharpened their appetite for more. Dalton appeared first, flanked by two other men from his squad. They walked with that same loose swagger soldiers wore when they believed themselves untouchable, powerful by proximity rather than merit. Dalton smirked the moment he saw Cole. He called out to him loudly enough for half the yard to hear. The words were casual on the surface, but the intent was sharp as a blade. He made a joke about Cole's balance issues, suggesting the base should mark the ground with training lines so the old man could walk safely without tripping again. More laughter followed. Even men who weren't part of Dalton's circle chuckled uncomfortably, trying to blend in so they wouldn't become the next target. It was easier to laugh at a man the base had discarded long ago than to risk standing beside him. Cole kept walking. His boots moved steadily, his back straight, not out of pride but because collapsing under the mockery would only give them something else to enjoy. He stepped into the hangar and the door slid shut behind him, muting the voices outside. Inside, the air smelled of grease, dust, and metal, a scent he understood better than any other. Rows of equipment lined the walls, each piece worn from years of service. Above, the ventilation fans hummed with a steady, mechanical heartbeat. Cole climbed the metal ladder toward the ventilation system, toolbox slung over his shoulder. Every rung echoed with a hollow clang. Halfway up, he paused to steady himself, not from weakness, but because something glinted at the edge of his vision. On the far wall, high above the ground, hung a framed display nearly invisible from below. It was dusty, half obscured by shadows, and easily overlooked. But from where he stood, Cole recognized it instantly. His breath caught in his chest. A photograph. A squadron standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a jet. Faces young, proud, determined. His squadron. The one nobody in this base even knew had existed. Time slowed for a moment. His eyes locked onto the image, tracing the contours of familiar faces, some alive, some long gone. The memories rose like smoke, curling around him with the same heaviness they had carried the night before. He took a slow breath, then another, grounding himself before the past could break through. He forced his attention back to the task and resumed climbing. The ventilation unit buzzed loudly above him, vibrating under the strain of cold air pushing through old ducts. He reached the top, unlatched the access panel, and got to work. He was tightening a bolt when the hangar door squealed open again. Dalton's voice spilled in like smoke. Apparently he and his men had assigned themselves a new goal, watching Cole work from below, making comments in loud whispers, treating the hangar like a stage and Cole like entertainment. Dalton joked that Cole was so old he might fall from the ladder and take half the hangar with him. The others laughed. One of them tossed a wrench upward toward the ladder, not enough to hit him, but close enough to rattle the first few rungs. Cole froze for a second. Not from fear. From restraint. He climbed down slowly, keeping his movements calm. The moment his boots hit the floor, Dalton stepped in front of him, arms crossed, amused. Cole didn't look at him. He simply walked to his toolbox, selected a different wrench, and headed back to the ladder. The men behind him exchanged glances. One of them muttered something about how Cole didn't even have the spine to stand up for himself. Another said men like him were the reason the base had lost its edge. Still, Cole ignored them. He climbed again. Higher this time. When he reached the top, he tightened another bolt. The metal groaned, then quieted. The system ran smoother now. Precise. Efficient. He moved to the next joint and began adjusting it, each rotation of his wrist controlled, measured. Below him, Dalton complained loudly that watching Cole work was boring. He wanted something more entertaining, something worth waking up for. A cruel idea formed in his voice, one that made the other men shift uncomfortably. Dalton reached up and shook the ladder. Hard. For a single moment, Cole felt gravity falter beneath him. His body lurched. The metal groaned. Tools shifted. A wrench slipped from his hand, hitting the ground below with a sharp clang that echoed through the hangar. Gasps rose. Even Dalton took a step back, unsure whether he had gone too far. Cole stayed perfectly still, gripping the edge of the ventilation duct, breath steady, eyes closed for one long moment as the echo faded. Then, slowly, deliberately, he climbed back down. Dalton looked ready to sneer, ready to laugh, ready to twist the moment into something he could use. But something in Cole's face stopped him. For the first time, Cole wasn't simply blank or beaten. He looked tired, but there was something deeper beneath that exhaustion. Something controlled. Something cold. Dalton backed up half a step without meaning to. But the moment passed. Cole picked up the fallen wrench, cleaned it on a rag hanging from his belt, and walked past the group without a word. As he stepped outside the hangar, the morning sun hit his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into him. And when he opened them again, he saw Airman Caleb Foster standing nearby, holding a clipboard to his chest. Foster wasn't laughing. He wasn't smirking. He was staring at Cole's sleeve. At the faded patch. At the symbol he recognized from an era most soldiers his age only read about in textbooks. Foster took a small step forward as if to speak, but Cole walked past him before he could. The young airman watched him go, heart pounding, the weight of an unanswered question tightening in his chest. Because if that patch was authentic, if it truly belonged to the unit he thought it did, then Henry Cole wasn't just a nobody the base mocked. He was something else entirely. Something important. Something dangerous. Something forgotten. And Foster knew, in that moment, that the story everyone thought they were watching was not the story unfolding at all. Foster couldn't focus on his duties for the rest of the morning. Every time he tried to return to paperwork, every time he tried to run errands between hangars, his thoughts kept circling back to that faded patch on Henry Cole's sleeve. It wasn't just old. It wasn't just discolored. It was historical, a relic of a unit disbanded decades earlier after an operation the military rarely spoke of anymore. And Cole wore it as if it meant nothing. As if it were just another threadbare detail on an old uniform. But Foster knew better. He'd spent half his childhood reading aviation history books, memorizing squadrons and markings the way other kids memorized baseball cards. His grandfather had served in the same era that patch came from. And the stories he told, the ones whispered at family gatherings when the adults thought the children weren't listening, matched the symbol sewn into Cole's sleeve. The symbol belonged to men who weren't supposed to exist anymore. Men who had flown missions without names. Men who had been erased. Foster stood outside Hangar 2 long after Cole disappeared into the distance. The cold stung his cheeks, but he barely felt it. Something was wrong in the base, deeply wrong, and he could sense it in the air like static before a storm. He turned sharply as the hangar door opened again. Sergeant Dalton strode out with his usual smugness, joking loudly with the men beside him about how he nearly shook the old man off the ladder. Foster looked away. He didn't trust his face not to betray what he felt. But inside his chest, something had shifted. Disgust. Anger. And something else, something like protectiveness toward a man he'd never spoken to. He needed answers. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. He walked toward the administrative building, the wind pushing against him as if trying to hold him back. Inside, the hallway lights flickered intermittently, giving everything a faintly haunted feel. He passed bulletin boards filled with announcements, training schedules, and outdated safety posters. None of it mattered. He reached the archive room, a cramped space lined with old filing cabinets, dusty shelves, and stacks of binders no one had touched in years. Most soldiers didn't even know the room existed. But Foster did. He'd been there once, searching for maintenance logs, and had accidentally discovered that the base's oldest documents were stored here. If Cole had a past worth hiding, it would be here too. He closed the door quietly behind him and walked to the back corner. The air smelled of paper and time. He traced a hand over the drawers until he found the section marked Personnel, Retired/Reassigned/Unlisted. Unlisted. That was the category he needed. He pulled the metal drawer open. It groaned loudly, protesting the movement. Inside, stacks of dusty folders sat untouched, the edges yellowed and curled. He began flipping through them, names he recognized, names he didn't, names of men who had vanished from the base long before he arrived. And then, he found it. A thin folder. Light. Almost empty. Labeled Cole H. He swallowed hard. Inside were only 2 documents. The first was a transfer order from many years earlier, stamped with red markings that suggested something had been classified at some point, and then declassified improperly. The second was a performance evaluation so vague it bordered on suspicious. Nothing was detailed. Nothing explained why a man of Cole's age, with no listed injuries, no family dependents, and no disciplinary record, had been placed into the lowest non-combat staff position on the base. It didn't make sense. Men like him were usually discharged, retired, or moved elsewhere. Not put here on a forgotten base, doing work below his evident level of skill. Foster flipped the transfer order over and saw something that tightened his chest. A stamp. Barely visible. Almost erased. A stamp belonging to the same unit as the patch on Cole's sleeve. It was enough to confirm that the patch was real. But why? Why would someone who had served in that unit end up reduced to this? Why hide a past like that? Before he could continue searching, footsteps approached the hallway. Foster froze, shoving the folder back into the drawer and closing it quietly but quickly. His heart hammered in his chest. The doorknob rattled once, then stilled. Whoever it was must have changed their mind. He exhaled shakily. He needed to get out before someone saw him. He left the archive room and stepped back into the cold, brisk air outside. His breath formed clouds that disappeared almost instantly. Across the yard, he saw Cole walking toward the supply shed, carrying a stack of metal panels balanced against his shoulder. He looked smaller than the men around him, but not weaker. Not anymore. Not to Foster. Something about the way Cole carried himself, even after the humiliation, even after nearly being knocked from a ladder, struck Foster as unnaturally steady. Controlled. Disciplined in a way that came from another life entirely. A life no one here knew existed. Foster took a step toward him. Then stopped. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed to be sure, more sure than a faded patch and a half-erased stamp in a forgotten folder. He needed more evidence. Something undeniable. Something that would explain why a man who belonged to history was sweeping floors in a base that treated him like nothing. Foster turned away and headed toward the flight line. If he was right, if Cole really was who he thought he was, then the truth wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Not with the air shifting the way it was. Not with secrets beginning to move beneath the surface. Not with the past waking up again. The storm didn't start with thunder or wind. It began the way most storms do in a place like Lanchester Field, quietly, with a rumor whispered in the wrong corner of the base, carried by men who enjoyed trouble more than truth. By midday, the air felt different. Heavier. Tense. Cole didn't notice it at first. He was in the workshop behind Hangar 3, sorting through damaged parts that needed repair. His movements were slow but sure, hands steady despite the cold metal biting at his skin. It was the kind of work he understood, logical, predictable, untouched by cruelty. But outside, something was shifting. A mistake had been made somewhere on the flight line. A part had failed during a routine systems check. The aircraft had been grounded. Schedules disrupted. Tempers flaring. Command wasn't pleased. And when command wasn't pleased, someone had to take the fall. It didn't take long for certain men to agree on who that someone should be. The workshop door slammed open with a force that rattled the shelves. Cole looked up just as Dalton marched inside, his face twisted in triumph rather than concern. Behind him stood 2 officers and 3 airmen, all with the same expression, one that said judgment had already been decided. Dalton pointed at Cole without hesitation. There he is. As if Cole had been hiding. As if he were prey cornered in a trap. One of the officers stepped forward, holding a clipboard with a printed report. He announced, with a voice sharp enough to cut through metal, that Cole had failed to properly inspect a set of components the previous day. That his negligence had compromised a critical aircraft. That his incompetence had jeopardized the safety of the entire base. Cole blinked slowly. He knew instantly the accusation wasn't true. He had inspected those components himself. Thoroughly. He remembered the pieces. The measurements. The torque of each bolt. He remembered because he always remembered. Precision was one of the last things he still had. But the men staring at him weren't looking for truth. They were looking for someone easy to blame. Cole opened his mouth to speak, but Dalton cut him off, loudly, theatrically, ensuring the entire workshop heard. Dalton accused him of being distracted, old, careless. He claimed Cole had been fumbling with tools all week. He told the officers Cole had nearly fallen from a ladder because he couldn't handle simple tasks anymore. The officers exchanged glances. And just like that, Dalton's words became gospel. Cole lowered his gaze. Not because he accepted guilt, but because he understood how these things unfolded. He had been in the military long enough to know that truth didn't always matter. The chain of command needed a clean resolution, and he was the cleanest option available. The officers ordered him to step outside for questioning. Cole obeyed, walking past the men who glared at him as though he had committed a crime. Some whispered. Others smirked. A few avoided his eyes entirely, ashamed to even witness the moment. Outside, the sky had deepened into a heavy gray. A cold wind pressed against his skin. The air tasted like metal and coming rain. The questioning was swift and sharp. Details. Timelines. Procedures. Cole answered each one with quiet clarity, his voice steady despite the humiliation pressing down on him. But the officers weren't listening. They didn't want explanations, they wanted closure. He could see it in the way they looked past him rather than at him. In the way they scribbled notes without hearing his words. Dalton hovered nearby the entire time, arms folded, face smug. He didn't speak, but his presence said enough. He stood tall, confident, feeding off the power he felt from watching Cole crumble beneath a weight he hadn't earned. When the officers dismissed Cole, Dalton stepped forward. He didn't need permission to speak, not when cruelty gave him courage. Dalton leaned in close, voice low, words sharp. He said the base would be better off without men like Cole. That Cole should have retired years ago. That if he couldn't do simple tasks, maybe the rumors about him being unstable were true. Cole froze. Unstable. The word hit him harder than the accusations. It was a word he had heard before, whispered behind closed doors, scribbled in confidential reports, spoken by men who believed trauma was weakness, who didn't understand what it meant to carry ghosts from battles no one wanted to admit had happened. Pain flickered across his face. And Dalton saw it. Saw it, and smiled. That smile did something to Cole's chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. A spark. A heat. A tremor of something that had been buried under decades of discipline and silence. Not anger aimed at Dalton, but anger aimed at the injustice itself, at the world that allowed men like him to rise while men like Cole were stepped on. The wind pushed harder now, snapping at the flags on the poles. The base had grown quiet around them, as if even the air sensed something was shifting. Cole stepped back, steadying himself. He wanted to walk away. He tried. But Dalton wasn't finished. He called out loudly, so everyone nearby could hear, that Cole should be stripped of his position, demoted further, maybe even discharged. He said Cole didn't deserve to wear the uniform at all. Cole stopped walking. And for the first time, he turned. He met Dalton's eyes. His own eyes were not filled with rage or fear, but with something Dalton had not expected. Something steady. Something old. Something dangerous. Dalton flinched. Only for a second. Only a twitch. But it was enough. Cole looked at him the way a man who had once stood in the center of a battlefield looks at someone who has never known real danger. Calm. Cold. Unmoved by petty cruelty. It lasted only a moment. Then Cole turned away again and walked toward the far side of the yard, where the older storage buildings cast long, lonely shadows. The officers called after him, but he didn't stop. He needed to breathe. To think. To hold himself together before the cracks spreading inside him widened into something he couldn't contain. He reached the far edge of the base, where the fence met the old trees and the wind howled through the gaps. He stood there for a long moment, jaw tight, chest rising and falling with forced control. This wasn't the first time he'd been falsely accused. But something about today was different. Something about the way the officers had looked at him. About the way Dalton had spoken. About the way the other soldiers had stared at him as though he had already been judged guilty. It all felt too familiar. Too much like another life. Too much like the moment everything had gone wrong all those years ago. Rain began to fall, thin, cold droplets that clung to his skin. Cole closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the years pressing against him, heavy as the sky above. He had given everything once. More than anyone here would ever know. And yet here he stood, accused, mocked, humiliated, again. But this time, someone had seen the truth. Even if he didn't know it yet. Across the yard, hidden beneath the overhang of a hangar, Foster watched him. He watched the officers. He watched Dalton. He watched the way Cole's shoulders tightened as he stood alone in the rain. And Foster understood something with absolute clarity. Cole wasn't breaking. He was bending. And men who bend, men who survive storms, are often the ones who rise the highest when the truth finally comes. Foster turned away, jaw set. He had seen enough. The lie was growing too large. And soon, the truth would have no choice but to break through. The rain didn't last long, but the heaviness it left behind lingered over Lancaster Field like a low ceiling. The clouds thinned just enough for a washed-out light to seep through, turning everything a muted gray. The base went back to its routine, yet something beneath the surface had shifted, like a wire pulled too tight, waiting to snap. Foster felt it with every step. He spent the afternoon pretending to focus on checklists and forms, but his mind wandered back to the archive room, to the thin folder with Cole's name, to the almost erased stamp linking him to a unit that officially no one talked about. The accusations thrown at Cole that day rang in his ears not as proof of incompetence, but as a deliberate move, a way to bury him further, to pin a failure on someone who wouldn't fight back. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just unfair. It was intentional. And that made it dangerous. As the day stretched on, an unexpected announcement rippled through the base. A retired colonel was visiting for a scheduled inspection and briefing. Most soldiers treated it like any other disruption, one more reason to make sure uniforms were straight and paperwork clean. But when Foster overheard the name of the visitor, his stomach tightened. Colonel Matthew Hargrove. His grandfather had mentioned that name once. Not as a story told proudly over dinner, but as a name spoken quietly, respectfully, when talking about men who carried secrets to their graves. Hargrove had served in the same era as the patch on Cole's sleeve. Foster's pulse quickened. If anyone could recognize what the rest of them were too blind to see, it would be him. The colonel arrived in the late afternoon. He stepped out of the vehicle with the deliberate, grounded stride of someone whose strength hadn't entirely faded with age. His hair was silver, his eyes sharp, scanning the base with a mixture of nostalgia and evaluation. Officers gathered quickly, falling into formation, shaking his hand, guiding him toward the main building for a formal briefing. Foster watched from a distance, a knot forming in his chest. He didn't have access to that meeting. He couldn't simply walk into a room full of high-ranking officers and ask about a forgotten staff man in a faded uniform. But there was something else he could do. He could make sure those two men crossed paths. He didn't know why he felt compelled to do it. He only knew that everything inside him screamed that it mattered. He found Cole near the maintenance shed, carrying a toolbox that looked far too heavy for his lean frame. The older man moved with familiar resignation, eyes down, shoulders set against the cold and against the world. Foster's feet moved before his mind had fully decided on the words. He approached slowly, matching Cole's pace. He didn't address the accusations. He didn't mention the patch. He simply told Cole, in a neutral tone, that command had requested all senior staff and long-serving personnel to be present in the main hangar for a brief historical address from the visiting colonel. It sounded official enough. Cole paused, frowning faintly, as if trying to recall if such a request had been made. Then he nodded once. He was used to being told where to stand, where to wait, where to be invisible. Foster felt a flicker of guilt. But over it, something louder insisted that the truth needed a chance to breathe. The main hangar was already filling when they arrived. Soldiers lined up in loose rows, officers clustered near the front. The hum of conversation bounced off the high metal ceiling, mixing with the distant line of engines outside. The smell of fuel and oil hung thick in the air. Cole slipped to the back, naturally migrating toward the shadows. Foster stayed closer than usual. Up front, Colonel Hargrove stood beside a small podium, exchanging a few quiet words with the base commander, Captain Reeves. Reeves wore his most polished expression, respectful, alert, trying to project an image of perfect competence. When the room settled, the colonel began to speak. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of years and battles no one in that hangar had ever seen firsthand. He spoke about the importance of discipline, of tradition, of learning from the past so that present mistakes did not become future tragedies. It was the kind of speech most had heard before in one form or another. But then his tone shifted. He began to talk about a specific period, about covert operations flown without broadcast, about missions carried out under such heavy classification that, for years, even the records barely reflected what had really happened. He spoke about a squadron that no longer existed by name, only by rumor. Foster's heart pounded. Cole stood very still at the back, eyes fixed on the far wall, not on the speaker. But his hands tightened around the handle of the toolbox he still carried, knuckles whitening slightly. Hargrove described a mission no one in that room had read about in official manuals. A mission flown into a hostile zone to extract trapped personnel when every conventional route had failed. A mission so dangerous that no one expected any of the pilots to return. But one had. Just one. The colonel did not give details, but his eyes grew distant as he spoke, as if the ghosts of those days hovered just beyond the hangar walls. He mentioned a pilot who had flown into nightmares and brought back lives no one had counted on recovering. He mentioned choices made in seconds that would haunt a man for years. He mentioned a name. A name that, to most in the hangar, meant nothing. But to one man at the back, it landed like a weight dropped on an old wound. Henry Cole. The toolbox slipped from his hand, hitting the concrete with a hollow clang that echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Every head in the hangar turned. Some toward the fallen toolbox. Some toward him. Colonel Hargrove stopped speaking mid-sentence. His gaze swept the room, following the source of the noise, and then stilled when it reached the back row. For a moment, time folded. The colonel's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in stunned recognition. His posture straightened. The years seemed to pull back ever so slightly from his face. He stepped away from the podium without a word to Reeves. The officers shifted uneasily. The soldiers looked between them, confused. Cole stood frozen, as if his boots had been welded to the floor. His shoulders felt heavier than they had in years. His chest rose and fell in short, controlled breaths. He didn't move to pick up the toolbox. He didn't look away. He couldn't. Hargrove walked slowly down the aisle between the rows of men, the sound of his steps echoing in the hushed hangar. No one dared speak. The atmosphere had shifted from boredom to something electric. Something reverent. He stopped a few feet from Cole and simply looked at him. He didn't salute. He didn't demand one. He simply searched his face, the way a man searches the horizon for a familiar shape through fog. Henry, his eyes seemed to say, though his lips didn't. Cole swallowed. The room watched. Most of them still didn't understand what they were witnessing. To them, this was a visiting officer staring at the lowest-ranking man in the room. But Foster knew. He felt it in his bones. The secret was no longer buried. It was standing in plain sight. Hargrove's gaze dropped briefly to the faded patch on Cole's sleeve. A slow breath escaped him, something like relief and sorrow mixed in equal parts. He straightened, then turned his head just enough for his voice to carry to the entire hangar. "There are men," he said, "who carry the weight of whole missions on their shoulders for the rest of their lives. Men whose stories will never be written in the manuals you study. Men who have walked through fire so the rest of you would never have to." The silence thickened. He looked directly at Cole as he said it. Cole's jaw clenched. His eyes glistened, just for a moment, catching the harsh hangar lights. Then he lowered his gaze again, as if trying to shrink back into the shadow that no longer wanted him. Reed shifted uncomfortably near the front, clearly feeling control of the room slip away from him. He moved toward the colonel, ready to redirect the speech, to bring it back to safe, rehearsed ground. But Hargrove raised a hand slightly, stopping him without looking. He wasn't finished. "Some of you," he continued, glancing slowly around the hangar, "believe you can measure a man's worth by the tasks you see him doing today. By the rank on his chest. By the job you think is beneath you. You laugh. You mock. You judge." His words cut through the air like cold wind. "Because you do not know what he has already survived." Dalton shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uneasy now, something tight forming in his throat. The men around him stood rigid, eyes forward, but their thoughts churned. Foster looked at Cole and saw not a broken man, but a battlefield contained in a single, human frame. Hargrove took one more step toward him. He didn't expose everything. He didn't list missions or medals or citations. But he said enough. He said there had been a pilot once who flew a mission that should have been impossible. A man who had refused to abandon comrades when ordered to turn back. A man who had returned with survivors in a flaming aircraft barely holding itself together, and then, when the applause faded and the reports were written, had chosen silence over glory. He didn't say Cole's name again. He didn't need to. The connection hung in the air, undeniable. Slowly, the colonel stepped back, giving Cole one last searching look, a silent apology for ghosts they both carried, then turned and walked up toward the front again. The spell broke gently, not with noise, but with the collective realization that something enormous had just shifted inside the walls of Lanchester Field. The man they laughed at in front of everyone wasn't who they thought he was. He never had been. And for the first time, the base began to feel the weight of its own blindness. For a long moment after Colonel Hargrove stepped away, the hangar remained frozen in a silence so heavy it felt physical. Men stood in rigid rows, eyes fixed straight ahead, but it was clear from their strained expressions that their thoughts were no longer in formation. Something had cracked in the atmosphere, something that could not be pushed back into place with orders or protocol. Cole didn't move. He seemed anchored to the spot, as if the colonel's words had unearthed a weight he'd buried too deep for too long. His jaw tightened. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. A storm raged inside him, not of pride, but of memory. Of ghosts he had never wanted near him again. He reached down quietly, almost mechanically, and picked up the fallen toolbox. The metal felt colder than before, its weight sharper, as though it too now carried the echoes of a past he had hoped would stay silent. As he lifted it, the soldiers nearest him drew back ever so slightly, uncertain now of the man they had mocked minutes earlier. Their eyes followed his movements with a mix of confusion, guilt, and something unspoken, something that felt like fear, not of him, but of what they had failed to see. Foster watched every detail, standing straighter than before, pulse heavy with realization. The Colonel's reaction had confirmed everything he suspected, and yet even knowing the truth, he felt humbled by the enormity of it. Cole wasn't just connected to the stories he'd heard growing up. He was one of them. And they had all been blind. Captain Reeves regained his composure last. He stepped forward, pulling the attention back to the front with forced authority, clearing his throat too sharply as if command could be restored by sound alone. He thanked the Colonel, offered stiff words, and dismissed the formation with an order that rang hollow. The men dispersed slowly. No one laughed. No one joked. No one nudged the person beside them with careless arrogance. They moved like men walking through thick fog, bumping into the edges of their own shame. Dalton stood rooted in place longer than any of them. His face had lost its confident color, the familiar smirk wiped clean. His eyes flicked from the Colonel to Cole, to the other soldiers, as if searching for someone who would tell him he'd misunderstood, that this wasn't happening, that the power he held that morning hadn't already slipped from his fingers. But no one looked at him. For the first time since arriving at the base, Dalton felt small. Cole turned to leave, not with pride, not with defiance, but with the quiet dignity of a man used to walking alone. His steps were not hurried or heavy, they were steady, the steps of someone who had survived enough storms that no new wind could topple him. As he reached the hangar exit, someone moved unexpectedly into his path. An airman stepped aside instantly, apologizing under his breath before realizing Cole wasn't reacting. Another shifted to make room, shoulders tense, mind racing for words that didn't come. The men parted like water around him, not out of reverence, but out of the sudden awareness that they had misjudged him so profoundly they no longer trusted their own eyes. Cole walked on, silent. Outside, the wind had eased, leaving the air cool and still. The clouds were thinning overhead, revealing faint streaks of pale sunlight. Cole breathed in quietly, his breath visible for a moment before fading. He didn't look back at the hangar. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift even from behind him. Foster hurried out a moment later, scanning the yard until he spotted Cole moving toward the far end of the base, the direction of the older storage buildings where traffic was minimal and solitude nearly guaranteed. His instinct pushed him to follow, to speak, to say something. But something stronger held him back. Respect. Cole had been stripped of the right to breathe freely all day. Foster understood that walking after him now, when the wound had just been torn open, would not be kindness. It would be intrusion. So he watched from a distance as the older man disappeared around the corner of a storage shed. Dalton stumbled out moments after, his movements abrupt and disoriented. His jaw clenched and unclenched. He wanted to regain control. To rebuild the image he had so carefully crafted. To prove that he still had power, that he still owned the room. But deep inside, he felt the truth gnawing at him, truth he wasn't prepared for. He walked toward his usual group of soldiers, but they didn't meet him with the same eager attention. Their faces were guarded. Their shoulders stiff. The mocking energy that had fueled their laughter was gone, replaced by uneasy silence. Dalton tried to laugh, to shrug off what had happened with a comment he hoped would sound casual. But the words landed flat. No one echoed them. No one supported him. No one wanted to stand near the man who had mocked someone they now feared they should have honored. Dalton's smile faltered. His authority was slipping through his fingers faster than he could tighten his grip. He clenched his fists and turned away, jaw tight, eyes burning as he watched the yard, searching for Cole again, for a way to reclaim what he'd lost. But Cole was gone. Cole wanted nothing more than to vanish back into the quiet corners where he'd hidden for years. He walked behind the storage sheds, the toolbox heavy in his hand, footsteps soft on the gravel. The thin sunlight illuminated the edges of his silhouette as he paused behind one of the buildings, letting the moment settle inside him. The colonel's words had dragged memories he had locked away out into the open, not with violence, but with a gentleness he wasn't prepared for. The past he carried quietly, the past that had scarred him, shaped him, and left him hollow, had been exposed without warning. He didn't want it back. He didn't want the eyes of the base on him. He didn't want questions. He didn't want praise. He wanted silence. He wanted routine. He wanted to keep walking unnoticed through a life he no longer knew how to leave. But secrets, once awakened, rarely grow quiet again. As he closed his eyes, the sound of the colonel's voice replayed, not the praise, not the reverence, but the unspoken recognition. It struck deeper than Dalton's mockery. Deeper than the accusations. It struck at a place inside him he thought had gone numb forever. Because someone remembered. Someone still carried the same ghosts. And ghosts, once stirred, refused to return to sleep. Around the corner of the shed, someone else watched, someone torn between fear and responsibility, between guilt and revelation. Foster. He hadn't meant to follow. But something drew him there, not curiosity anymore, but duty. Not military duty, but human duty. He saw the older man standing alone, shoulders heavy, breath slow, the silent battlefield of memory unfolding behind his eyes. Foster didn't speak. He didn't approach. He simply watched, understanding that something enormous was shifting inside Henry Cole, something the base would soon feel. Because the truth had come alive. And the truth, once awakened, does not stay small. Not here. Not anymore. News travels fast on a base, but guilt travels faster. By the next morning, Lancaster Field felt different. The routines were the same on the surface, boots on concrete, engines humming, radios crackling, but the glances weren't. Men looked at each other and then away too quickly, as if afraid their eyes might betray what they were thinking. They'd all heard the same thing, passed from one quiet conversation to the next. The colonel knew him. The colonel talked about him. The colonel said he had flown that mission. No one said the name out loud at first. Henry Cole. It felt wrong now, paired with the memories of laughter that still echoed from days before. Saying his name meant confronting the fact that they had mocked, pushed, and humiliated someone who might be far more than they had allowed themselves to believe. And yet, command had said nothing. No formal announcement. No correction. No apology. On paper, Cole was still just a low-ranking staff man assigned to routine maintenance. On paper, the failed inspection was still his fault. On paper, nothing had changed. But reality had. By mid-morning, an unusual order went out. All personnel were to assemble once more in the main hangar. It was an inconvenience most days. Today, it felt like a reckoning. Soldiers moved toward the hangar in uneasy lines, the murmur of speculation humming beneath the surface like static. Dalton walked with his squad but felt strangely separate from them, their shoulders drawing inward, their eyes refusing to rest on him for long. His confidence had become a thin shell, and the cracks were starting to show. Inside, the hangar lights burned brighter than usual, casting harsh white over steel beams and aircraft silhouettes. A table had been set near the front, holding several folders, a laptop, and a box no one could identify from a distance. Captain Reeves stood there, jaw tight, expression sharper than usual. Beside him stood Colonel Hargrove, arms folded behind his back, gaze steady as he watched the room fill. Cole arrived late, as if hoping to slip into the background unnoticed. He carried no toolbox this time. He walked with that same quiet step, moving toward the back out of habit. But the closer he drew, the more it became clear that something had shifted in the way the others saw him. Some stepped aside with more intention now. Some dipped their heads ever so slightly, as if unsure whether to treat him differently, but unable not to. Cole ignored it all. He stood in the back row, hands loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on a point somewhere near the front but not quite on anyone. His face was carefully blank, created over years of learning how not to react. Reeves cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the vast space. He began with formalities, speaking of recent events, inspection, evaluation of base procedures. His tone was stiff, almost brittle. It was the voice of a man who knew he was about to stand in a light he had not chosen. Then he said something that made the room still. He announced that, per the Colonel's review, the incident involving the grounded aircraft had been re-examined. The initial fault, he admitted, had been assigned too quickly. Additional checks had revealed a manufacturing defect, one that no standard inspection, however diligent, could have detected. The failure had not been the result of negligence. The failure had not been Henry Cole's fault. The words drifted through the hangar like a slow, cold wind. Some men closed their eyes briefly, relief and shame mixing in their chests. Others stared at the floor, heat rising to their faces. Dalton felt his stomach drop. Reeves paused, swallowed, and said the next part more quietly. Furthermore, he added, it had been brought to his attention that certain behavior on the base had fallen below acceptable standards of respect and conduct. He didn't name anyone. He didn't have to. The weight of the statement settled on the men who knew exactly who they were. Dalton's throat tightened. Then Reeves stepped back. Colonel Hargrove stepped forward. No podium this time. No script. Just a man with a voice that carried decades. He didn't talk about procedures or discipline now. He talked about memory. He talked about the cost of forgetting the people who built the ground others walked on. He talked about how easy it was to see only a uniform in a task, and not the history behind the hands that performed it. Then he did something no one expected. He reached for the box on the table and opened it. Inside, cushioned in dark velvet, lay several medals, ribbons, and a small metal insignia engraved with the symbol of the disbanded unit Foster had recognized on Cole's sleeve. The Colonel lifted them carefully, one by one, speaking not to the room first, but to the memory of the missions they represented. He spoke of bravery, of leadership, of decisions made in the darkest hours of the night when no one was watching. He described a pilot who had flown through enemy fire to reach comrades stranded behind collapsing lines. A pilot who had stayed in the air when others turned back, who had landed a wounded aircraft against all odds, carrying survivors who wouldn't be alive without him. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. Then he turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Toward the back of the hangar. Toward Henry Cole. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Hargrove stepped forward, closing the distance between front and back, between rank and forgotten status, between past and present. The medals in his hand glinted under the hangar lights, casting small, shifting reflections across the faces of the men watching. He stopped in front of Cole. The room held its breath. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. No one could hear the words spoken in their silence, but everyone could feel them. Years. Loss. Choices. Regret. Survival. Then, in a voice steady but thick at the edges, Hargrove said that there are men who never asked for recognition, and yet deserved it more than most. Men who hid from the spotlight because the weight of what they had done was too heavy to celebrate. Without asking permission, the Colonel reached for Cole's uniform. He pinned one of the medals to his chest. Cloth rustled. Metal clicked. The sound was louder in that moment than any applause could have been. Cole's eyes burned, not with pride, but with the complicated ache of a man being forced to stand in front of ghosts he'd tried to outrun. His hands flexed at his sides, fingers curling, then loosening, resisting the urge to push the metal away. He didn't want this, not like this, not here. But denying it would mean denying the men who hadn't come back. And he would never do that. The colonel stepped back and turned to the room. "This," he said quietly, "is the man some of you thought it was safe to laugh at." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sentence cut cleaner than any shout. Dalton felt as if the hangar floor had opened beneath him. The images flashed through his mind in sharp, unforgiving detail: the crate, the bolts scattered across the ground, the kick, the stomp on Cole's hand, the shaking ladder, the jokes, the false accusations spoken with such careless ease. He felt them now not as acts of dominance, but as acts of shame. Around him, other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at Cole with wide eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. Others couldn't bring themselves to lift their heads at all. Foster stood straighter than ever. Not in pride for himself, but in honor of the man who had borne so much in silence. The colonel closed the box and placed it back on the table. He didn't demand applause. He didn't invite it. The hangar remained quiet. No one was sure if they were allowed to clap for a man they had failed so completely. So instead, they stood in a silence that had finally become honest. Cole looked down at the metal on his chest. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt exposed. But when he lifted his gaze and scanned the room, he saw something he had not experienced in years. Not pity. Not scorn. Not mockery. Something else. Something like respect. Tentative, ashamed, uncertain. But real. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. That would require more than a medal and a speech. It would require change. It would require apologies. It would require men like Dalton to face the truth about themselves. But it was a beginning. For the first time, the base saw him not as the man who dropped crates, not as the target of casual cruelty, but as someone whose story stretched far beyond the walls of Lanchester Field. The man they laughed at in front of everyone had once carried entire lives in his hands. And now, finally, the weight of that truth rested on all of them. The hangar slowly emptied after the ceremony, but the silence it left behind seemed to cling to the air like the lingering haze after an engine shuts down. The base returned to its routine, but the rhythm was off, disrupted, softened. Men walked differently, spoke differently, looked at each other differently. A truth that had been buried under years of assumption now sat openly in the middle of Lanchester Field, impossible to ignore. At the center of that truth stood Henry Cole. He walked out of the hangar alone, metal still pinned awkwardly against the worn fabric of his uniform. He didn't touch it. Didn't look at it. To him, it seemed out of place, a reminder of a life he'd stepped away from long ago, a fragment of a past he had worked tirelessly to silence. He made his way toward the far edge of the yard, where the storage buildings cast long, familiar shadows. He wanted distance. He wanted quiet. He wanted the world to shrink back to the small, manageable shape he knew how to carry. But solitude no longer followed him as smoothly as before. Footsteps approached from behind, soft, hesitant, unsure. Foster. He stopped several feet away, careful not to intrude. "Sir," he began, then corrected himself quickly, voice gentler, more human, "Henry." Cole exhaled slowly, his breath forming a thin cloud in the cool air. For a moment he didn't turn, as if gathering the courage to face someone who saw more than he wanted seen. Finally, he looked over his shoulder. Foster stood there with a posture that was neither formal nor casual, shoulders tense, hands clasped behind his back in a way that seemed instinctive rather than required. His eyes held a mixture of awe and guilt, respect and something close to sorrow. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't understand. Cole nodded once, as if the words were expected. Most don't, he said, voice steady but hollow. That's how it was meant to be. Foster swallowed. The apology forming in his chest felt too small for the weight of what he had witnessed. Too small for the weight of what Cole had carried. Too small for the humiliation the base had put on a man they should have honored. He tried anyway. I'm sorry, Henry. For all of it. For everything we didn't see. Cole watched him for a long, silent moment. Instead of anger, something else flickered behind his eyes, a tired understanding, a kind of weary acceptance that comes only from a man who has lived through storms far larger than public humiliation. You're not the one who needs to apologize, Cole said. Foster's gaze dropped. No, he murmured. But I'm still sorry. Cole said nothing more. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was necessary, like a breath taken after drowning. From across the yard, another figure approached. Dalton. He walked with none of the swagger he once carried like armor. His steps were uneven, unsure. His face was pale, jaw clenched, eyes hollow with the realization of what he had done, not just the cruelty, but the blindness, the arrogance, the pleasure he had taken in mocking a man whose shadow he wasn't worthy to walk in. Foster straightened instinctively, ready to intervene if Dalton spoke the wrong words. But Dalton didn't look at Foster. He looked only at Cole. And then something happened no one in the base would have predicted even a day earlier. Dalton stopped in front of him and lowered his head. I was wrong, he said, voice rough and stripped of its usual confidence. His eyes didn't rise from the ground. I was wrong in every way a man can be. I didn't listen. I didn't see. I didn't want to see. Cole's face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. He simply listened. Dalton swallowed hard, voice breaking as he forced the words out. I'm sorry. Not because of the medal. Not because of the story. I'm sorry because I treated you like nothing. Because I let myself believe that worth is measured by rank or noise or the people who laugh at your jokes. His voice cracked. And I'm ashamed. The apology was raw. Uneven. Stripped of pride. And for the first time in a very long time, Dalton felt fear in a way that had nothing to do with power, fear of the man standing before him, not because Cole was dangerous, but because he was honorable. Cole looked at him quietly. He didn't say I forgive you. He didn't say you're right. He didn't say you're wrong. Instead, he spoke with the weight of someone who had lived long enough to understand the difference between remorse and transformation. You have to live differently now, he said softly. That's all that matters. Dalton nodded, shoulders shaking slightly. He stepped back, not out of fear, but out of reverence, something he had never felt before today. He walked away slowly, each step heavy, each breath a burden. Foster let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Cole watched Dalton go, then turned back toward the storage buildings. The metal glinted faintly against the dimming afternoon light. He touched it finally, gently, not to admire it, but to acknowledge what it meant, and what it cost. He knew this moment wasn't redemption for him. It was redemption for them. The base had changed. But something in him had changed too, something he hadn't expected. A door he thought had rusted shut had opened a fraction. Enough for air to move through. Enough for ghosts to shift. Enough for the past to stop feeling like a wound and start feeling like a story he didn't have to carry alone. Foster took a step closer. Henry, he said softly, there's still one thing I don't understand. Cole looked at him, waiting. Why did you stay here? After everything you'd been? Cole turned his gaze to the horizon, where the clouds were parting just enough to reveal a thin strip of fading light. Because, he said quietly, sometimes a man hides not to escape others, but to survive himself. The wind carried the words gently across the yard. And for the first time, Foster truly understood. The sun dipped slowly behind the line of hangars, painting the base in muted gold and long shadows that stretched like memories across the concrete. Evening at Lanchester Field had always felt quiet, but tonight the silence carried a different weight, not the heavy kind that pressed a man down, but the kind that comes after a long storm has finally passed, when the air is washed clean and everything feels sharper, brighter, painfully honest. Cole walked slowly across the yard, the metallic click of the metal on his chest echoing softly with each step. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound tied to a life he had deliberately walked away from. Now it followed him like an old friend he wasn't sure he was ready to greet. He reached the small maintenance shed and placed his toolbox on the worn wooden bench outside. The sky above had begun to blush with the deep oranges and purples of dusk. In the fading light, his shadow stretched long and narrow, merging with the shadows of the tools, the equipment, the base he knew better than he knew himself. For a moment, he stood still, letting the cool air brush against his face. He felt lighter, but not in the way a man feels when he sets down a burden. More in the way a man feels when he finally acknowledges he has been carrying one for far too long. Somewhere behind him, the sound of boots approached softly. He didn't turn immediately. He recognized the rhythm of those steps, not heavy, not arrogant, but deliberate, respectful. Foster. He stopped a few feet away, waiting. Cole appreciated that about the young man. He didn't rush. He didn't demand space he hadn't earned. He simply stood beside the weight of the moment, letting it breathe. "Henry," Foster said quietly, but not timidly. The single word carried warmth, honesty, and a sense of reverence that had been absent from the base until today. Cole turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving at Lanchester Field years ago, he didn't feel the need to shrink or disappear. Foster's eyes held no pity, no confusion, no fear, only gratitude and a quiet kind of admiration. "There's something you should see," Foster said. He motioned gently for Cole to follow. They walked together toward the main hangar. The doors had been left partially open, letting a sliver of orange light spill into the dim interior. The base had emptied for the evening, but the hangar wasn't vacant. Inside, men from different units moved silently, working together with an unusual sense of purpose. They weren't laughing. They weren't chatting. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were cleaning, polishing equipment, organizing tools, sweeping the floor. The sort of tasks Cole had done alone for years, often ignored, often mocked. But now they did it together. Not because they had been ordered to, because they wanted to. When they noticed Cole standing in the doorway, the movement slowed. Not out of awkwardness, out of respect. A few nodded. A few straightened. A few looked at him with a kind of quiet apology they weren't yet brave enough to speak aloud. Cole hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to step inside. Foster placed a light hand on his arm. "This is because of you." Cole swallowed hard. One of the older sergeants approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look ashamed. He looked humbled. "We should have been better," he murmured. "That's all." He walked away before Cole could respond, returning to his work as if the statement itself had been its own kind of healing. Cole stepped farther inside. The metal on his chest caught the fading light, glinting softly like a heartbeat. As he reached the center of the hangar, something caught his eye, a small frame resting on an equipment crate. Foster picked it up and handed it to him. It was the old squadron photograph he had hidden behind manuals in the storage shed, the one he thought no one had ever seen, the one he had believed was safe only when out of sight. But now it had been cleaned, gently restored, placed inside a simple dark frame. Cole's breath faltered. His fingers trembled as he touched the edge of the glass. The faces in the picture stared back at him, younger versions of men whose voices still lived somewhere deep in his memory, men he had flown with, fought with, lost. Men whose stories he had tried to bury because remembering them hurt too much. Foster spoke softly beside him. "We thought it belonged somewhere better than the back of a shelf." Cole couldn't speak. His throat tightened with a grief too old and too deep to voice. For years, he had lived like a ghost among the living. Now, looking at the faces of the men who shaped him, he felt the living reach back toward him, inviting him out of the silence he'd been hiding behind. He placed a hand on the frame, not as a gesture of possession, but of recognition, of acceptance, of mourning, and of gratitude. Behind him, footsteps approached again. Dalton. He walked slower than before, posture humble, expression burdened. His gaze flicked to the metal, then to the photograph, then to Cole. Everything in his face revealed that the weight of his actions had finally settled fully. "Henry," he said quietly, voice low but steady, "I can't undo what I did. I can't change the way I treated you, or who I was when I did it." Cole watched him silently. "But I can change now." Dalton's voice wavered. "I will change." Cole looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with judgment. With clarity. He nodded once. Dalton let out a shaky breath, not relief, not forgiveness, but the first step of a man choosing to walk differently. He stepped back. The hangar seemed to breathe with them all. Outside, dusk deepened, and the first stars appeared in the thinning sky. Cole stepped out into the cool air again, Foster walking by his side. The base felt different now, not new, not reborn, but real. Honest. The first place in a very long time where silence didn't feel like a cage. Foster glanced at the medal still pinned to Cole's chest. "Are you going to keep it?" Cole touched the metal lightly, the cold surface grounding him. "I'll keep it," he said softly. "Not for what it says about me, but for what it says about the men who never came home." Foster nodded. And for the first time since the day he arrived, Cole felt something shift inside him, something like warmth, like the faint trace of belonging. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had been given a place. A place that didn't own him anymore. He turned toward the lonely road leading to his small house beyond the trees. The sky above glowed faintly with stars just beginning to pierce through the dusk. He walked with a steadier step than before, the metal tapping softly against his chest with each movement. Behind him, the base lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating the runways, the hangars, the water tower that had watched him for years. And for once, those lights didn't feel like watchful eyes. They felt like company. He kept walking. Not to hide this time, but simply to go home. For tomorrow, when he returned, the base would not see him as the man they once mocked. They would see him as he had always been. And for Henry Cole, that was enough.